Hi folks, Michael here. Did you ever consider the path of academia? Should you become one? How to become one? And life as one? Well folks, first, let me give you some background. So my parents back in Ireland were a teacher and an academic. So that was my backstory. And even before the 2008 financial crisis, going back to 2005 and 2006, so first in the real world, in stockbroking industry, and then later in the academic industry, I kind of moved away from following money towards something more in terms of intellectual curiosity and making an impact. There was also the joy of teaching and that instant gratification. Of course, there's also the delayed gratification as well of research. With that said, a quick commercial break, but like from a once broke professor who actually made it work. If you're working on your finances, I made a free guide that might help. It's called 10 Money Moves to Make Before Your Next Milestone. And it's the exact checklist I used early on to start building real wealth. You'll find the link below. Short, practical, and completely free. Now that I've sold you on something that costs exactly $0, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. So I'm not gonna lie to you. Money, it's not going to be the highest paying, although on the hourly rate, it pretty much is right up there, one of the highest paying for the hourly rate. But in terms of the annual or the yearly salary, look, given all the work you've put in, the number of years you've studied away, you probably worked hard as an undergrad, maybe for 4 years, you got into a top master's or a PhD program, worked for another good few years, and then you got into a academic position, maybe you've gone through pre-docs, post-docs, you've done tenure track, and eventually you get to that much coveted position of a tenured academic professor. Look, you put in at least most likely 15 or maybe even longer, maybe 20 years. Now, if you'd gone in and worked that hard in industry, you might have made more, depending on the field. So it's not going to be the highest annual, but you are getting that trade-off, you're getting that job security. And the hourly rate at that point, because you're not going to be working the same number of hours as someone in industry who might get, 2 days off a year, right? I'm exaggerating, but in comparison where you've got long summer, you've got long breaks at winter, different other breaks as well. Now you're going to do your research on the side, but you're not expected to be in the office from 8 in the morning until 7 or 8 at night, like a lot of the comparable jobs would be asking you to do. Like, you are working at home, you are working on your stuff, but it's not the same pressure, because I find that stress that you put yourself through by choosing what to do is a lot less hurtful or damaging than stress that others, so if you're working for someone else the whole time being told what to do, as opposed to you are working on your own research, right? It's your baby, your research idea, your project. Could be like your PhD, or it could be the research you're doing as a professor. It's a lot less stressful because you get to choose it. You love it. At the end of the day, this is why you chose academia. You weren't really going after the money. If you wanted money, you could go to Wall Street, right? Or do something different. But the hourly rate is very high. And beyond the hourly rate, the time freedom, right? In the sense that, your time is your own. You get all these breaks during summer, during winter. If you have to live in multiple countries like myself or some other professors on the same corridor here who they commute from different continents. The task freedom as well, like you get to work on what you want, right? If you're studying as an undergraduate, you choose your degree. You also get to choose the topics that you study and the courses that you study. And then when you do your PhD and you do your graduate's degree, you can typically choose, hopefully you get a certain amount of choice in what school that you can attend, and also what advisor and what research topic that you want to do. It really gets better. The more you go on, the more freedom that you have, and the more you're doing what you love doing. Usually at the beginning, you're taking generals, it could be prelims where you got to study a lot of stuff, but then you get into the field courses. These are courses that you chose specifically. You're narrowing down. And then ultimately it's your dissertation. And then eventually it's just you're working on that dissertation and other papers after it as an academic. Now, as well as teaching, look, it's going to be subjects usually that are within your purview, which in your field, within your ability to teach. So you probably enjoy teaching these subjects, right? Otherwise, why did you study this for so long? And you get a lot of freedom in terms of, well, what book to use sometimes, what topics to cover, how to cover them, within certain guidelines. But there's a lot of task freedom in that regard. In research, it's one of the most ultimate things. I mean, you are choosing, eventually you become the principal investigator or the PI. So you are making a lot of the choices. You are becoming almost like the CEO. The further you go up, the more senior that you get. And you're allocating a lot of the tasks either to research assistants that are college students, either undergrad or grad students. Sometimes you're also kind of more mentoring or advising in terms of research. Like if you're working on a project and you're working with, let's say, some postdocs or more likely some assistant professor, tenure track people who are hungry to get tenure, they're publish or perish mentality. You know, you may not be doing as much of the work eventually. At the senior professor level, that's usually the case. They're usually, there are exceptions, and they do like to work. A lot of professors we still do like to work. So I'm an associate, but a lot of the seniors do like to work still on these projects, but they are more kind of advisory because of the seniority of their thing. They're looking over the final draft, how to sell it, how to market, making the final big choices. And there's that daily variety when you're doing something new every day. You're learning something new. Maybe you're on media one day, you're being asked to comment in the media. You're being asked to give a certain talk. You're traveling for a certain conference. You're marking different projects. You're researching a new topic. You're doing a field course. Some of my colleagues in development economics, for instance, they're going off to Africa for certain travels, for doing certain field experiments. It's always different, so it's always learning. That's a wonderful thing with academia. It doesn't get old. And there's the networking with the bright minds. I mean, there's something wonderful about going to conferences and meeting these people. Be Nobel Prize winners or people who may get Nobel Prize winners in the future. And there's the big thing, there's the esteem or the kudos, and that can't be underrated. Now, there's different pay across different departments and different pay across different parts of the world. So, rule of thumb, typically speaking, is the US pays more than the rest of the world. Now, it can vary, and you can look into the different cost of living and different indices like that. Switzerland is quite well paid, etc. But by and large, the US is where academia is. It's kind of like the top level of academia, some of the top research institutions in the world. Your Harvards, your MITs, your Princetons, but even Stanford, Berkeley, UPenn, the Brown, like Ivy League places like Dartmouth. Then you got Chicago, bunch of Midwestern schools, a lot of the top state schools like Penn State, etc. There's just even like Caltech, you name it. There's just a lot of top like teams, like soccer teams or football teams. You've got some of the best teams here in terms of universities in the US. Those networking effects, the productivity. And so you tend to get some of the actual highest pay here in the US. Now, beyond the US, even within different colleges, of course, some of the higher up you go in terms of the research universities, or in certain states or certain cities, certain places where there's higher cost of living, they tend to pay more. Also in terms of within the same university, even in different departments, different colleges. So it could be that in your school, it could be that the law school is paying a bit more, or in another school, the medical school could pay more, or in another university, it could be that the business school pays more. And even within, let's say, the business school, it could be that the department in finance pays more than, let's say, the department in accounting or marketing, or vice versa. So there can be quite a lot of differences even within the school and within the college and within the various part components. And of course, the opposite can sometimes be true, where it's all standardized and it's pretty much the same for just the levels, the only difference of the pay. So places like Ireland is typically one of those places where, typically speaking, a lot of the schools pay about the same because of the government, the public sector aspect. And so it's fairly even. Of course, there is that pay scale does rise as you go up in Ireland too, quite a lot. So in terms of characteristics, you really need to possess intellectual curiosity. This is going to be vital for research, but also you're going to show this in terms of teaching. And if you're like teaching or you're good at teaching, that can be something that helps you decide whether you want to do an academic route. Now, I'm not going to lie, academic prowess or college grades matter. And research, I mean, that's going to be the big one, right? In terms of getting qualifications, like a PhD or a doctoral degree has a lot to do with research. Obtaining a job is almost entirely to do with your research, and even promotion and permanence or academic tenure has mostly to do with research. So they're your characteristics. Well, in terms of your qualification, college grades matter, and the most important actually is references. References from your professors. Now, it's important that you get good references, and what I mean by that is when you're looking for people who to give you reference, it should be people who are quite established in their discipline. They're renowned, maybe they're famous, they've got a good history of publishing, etc. Now, there is a trade-off, right? If you go to someone that's like a Nobel Prize winner and they don't know you from Adam, then there's that trade-off, right? You want to have a certain amount of knowledge of the professor, so taking courses, being a research or teaching assistant, meeting them in their office, like interacting with them, the more you reach out, be proactive, etc., the better this is going to be. But something also that's great and maybe not thought about is, look, after your undergraduate, usually you pay a lot in your undergraduate years, you tend to get paid. The reverse is true, unless you're doing a cash cow degree like an MBA, like a master's, a terminal master's. Above that, if you're going to a research or a doctoral, like a PhD, you typically, if they want you, they're going to pay for you to do that degree. So it's kind of counterintuitive and not always known. You know, of course, if you're in academia, you know this, it's bread and butter, but a lot of people don't know, right? A lot of the mainstream people or lay people don't know this in advance, right? So you do get paid typically to do a PhD. Now you're not making a lot because you're getting the degree, right? So, but you're usually given room and board, or the equivalent of room and board, the money that you get, and you're usually given like the fees are kind of paid for. You get a scholarship, you get full funding, full tuition, so a stipend that allows you to pay for your rent. You get your health insurance and a bit extra. And the stipends have gone up over the years. For instance, back in the 70s and 80s, it was common to be living really below the poverty line. In the say 2000s and the 2010s, it was around sort of 20 to 30,000 in some of the top colleges. Now it's more like 40,000 and up. Of course, this is getting changed depending on the funding. But this research funding and the places are increasingly competitive. And really it's all about research. Research more so than teaching. Now there are certain institutions that prioritize teaching and value teaching more than research. But by and large, institutions are focusing on research when they're hiring you with a PhD. Because a lot of the times they could just hire someone with a master's degree to teach. But if they want to do research, that's where they're looking for a PhD. Now, you really do want to kind of clarify that you love research if you're applying to these programs more than you like to teach. That's the point. But beyond this, you have standardized tests, things like the Graduate Record Examination, or GRE. And there can be GMATs in certain places, LSATs, there's all kinds of different standardized tests, but the GREs are a major one. Usually, depending on the program that you're doing, there might be a certain area of the GRE that's more important. For instance, it could be the case that you need to score very highly on the maths part if you want to do a PhD in economics or finance, for instance. Your college grades also matter, and in economics or finance, a lot of the time it's the maths. You really need to show a lot of mathematical subjects you've taken, right? It's not just good enough to get a 4.0 GPA by taking all easy A courses that don't really have much of a relation to what you're going to do afterwards, or at least even a transferable skill. Like if you do engineering and you do, astrophysics and very difficult undergraduate challenging courses, sure, but if you do more what would be considered easy courses, it's not going to really help you in terms of applying to graduate schools, in particular if you're doing something that's more even social science or hard science or more technical courses. But the big one really is the references. That's the number one. Then the college grades, and of course the GREs are just like the standardized tests are just like your necessary. It's pretty much like having a driver's license. It lets you apply, right? But it doesn't really get you over the line. It's more of a thing that they're going to throw out or discard, because there's a lot of observational equivalence, right? There's a lot of different people coming in applying, huge amount of applicants for a very few number of positions in a lot of the top programs. So the standardized tests are just how to throw out a lot of the other applicants that don't meet certain minimum thresholds. Beyond that, it's really about your references and your college degree. If it's a good college, it could be the case if you don't come from a top undergraduate college that you might need to do a master's first from a really good master's program, and then use that to get into your PhD of your choice. So it could be a more circuitous route to get there eventually, but the trajectory really matters. It's very difficult to boost your trajectory. Like if you want to end up with a Nobel or end up at Harvard, it's difficult if you don't already start at Harvard, right? That's the idea, is that you need to try to, at every point, try to get onto the best path possible for you. It will converge eventually. People do tend to converge. If they went to a top school, but maybe they're not the top researcher in the world, they're not probably going to end up there. And vice versa. You could have gone to a very low tier school. It's difficult, but there are cases of people that have kind of gradually floated up over the years into top places. Now, if you have publications, that's great to list when you're applying. And any research experience, that too. More and more, pre-doctoral programs are becoming necessary or encouraged to get into some of the top PhD programs. So a pre-doc usually is a little bit like a research assistance or research internship program where you're paid, and it can be very good. Some of the top places, like the higher, if you get to a place like Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania and you do a pre-doctoral program there, it can really open doors, especially if you went to a lower, mediocre undergraduate program, but you've gone to a slightly better master's program. Then you basically use that master's program to leverage yourself into a really top pre-doctoral program, and in the pre-doc you get into a really top PhD program. So there's things like that. Also, if you don't come out with the best PhD, you can do a postdoc or a series of postdocs before you land at a good assistant professorship program. Now, there's a big difference between masters and PhD, right? Masters, typically we're thinking about you pay for the masters. It's mostly taught. There are some research ones. They're usually not as useful as the taught ones, because they're more terminal. You're not really learning skills, and PhD programs are more interested actually if you've shown that you've done taught masters, even though it's maybe counterintuitive, because it shows that, okay, you've done these courses at a high level, at a master's level, that then would make you a stronger candidate for their PhD program. And the acceptance rates are also really difficult to get it. So the acceptance rates, the lower the acceptance rate, usually indicates that the course or the program is pretty tough, it's pretty challenging. Nobody really wants to go to a program where they're actually giving everybody that applies a place, right? It's not worth it. And also, how can they supervise that many students? And in terms of getting accepted into the PhD programs, right? Once you've done all that application, and it's stressful enough as it is, but once you're sitting back, you're waiting a few months, when you hear back from it, usually the first thing is flyouts, and they're great to go to flyouts, right? To get a feel for the program. Now, if you've got multiple programs and you're finding it hard to choose, it's just a great opportunity to do this. And asking questions like, talk to some of the PhD students that are there, the candidates, particularly those that are in their second and higher years, and meet with them and ask them, what would you have liked to know before that you did the preliminary examinations at the end of your first year? So what advice can they give to you as an incoming student that they would love to have received before they attended? There's also negotiation on funding, and funding really is a big thing. Now, there's also prelims. They can be really stressful. I found them super stressful. I think most vast majority of students do. There are very few exceptions to that rule. And the preliminary examinations, usually at the end of your first year, have to do with all the taught material. Usually the second year you're doing field courses, ones that you study, that you've chosen, and they usually involve more exams, but also sometimes research projects, and usually something along the lines of a paper by the end, sometimes a viva at the end, like an oral exam in some colleges. And then at the third year, you're usually doing a third year paper. So that's usually, you choose it at the end of your second year or over that summer, and then you do your third year paper in your third year. And really that's important to hit that target. Like you must pass a certain threshold. At the end of your third year, when you've done that, then you're really, from then on, you're working on your dissertation. Year 3, year 4 onwards. That's in the US. Again, it depends on the college you go to. The field is all different, and even the university and the country, of course, as well. The fields really are fun, and as well as the research part, that's where it gets a lot less stressful. You know, the fields, you really learn the skills that you need, the advanced level skills that are invaluable. And the better the university you go to, that's where you're really getting the benefit. Like getting into the top programs, it's usually the benefit of getting that experience in the field course. Now, not all is lost. If you don't get into top PhD programs, you know, now a lot of these field courses are taught online, so you can usually be able to download or watch things online, or even attend some of these courses yourself in certain annual meetings or in certain summer programs. Like Barcelona has a great program, the GSE in economics over the summer. Also the NBER has some great summer programs. And then you're doing your research, and then it's really up to you. At that point, you're only showing up to your particular disciplines, usually weekly talks. So there's usually a weekly seminar that you attend and you partake in, and then maybe once a term you might present your research. So it's a club, right? You show up to help other people and they show up when you present. And then when you go in the job market, look, that's a whole big kettle to go into, but the big choices usually are industry / policy or public institutions, things like that, versus academia. Now, you could go into industry working for private sector, or you could go into think tanks or government organizations, policy institutions, kind of research, we're looking for researchers, or you can go into something like academia. So, the profession post-qualification, is it worth it? Absolutely. That's what I would say anyway. It definitely is. After you qualify, you've got tenure track. So this is usually the track, the number of years where you're at an institution, and it's kind of like probation. And after a certain number of years, if you pass what is usually quite subjective, sometimes it's objective, and if you're lucky enough, you'll pass, you get permanence for the coveted academic tenure. And then post-tenure, it's another life again altogether completely. But it, usually there's a certain amount of similarity. So there's a lot of similarity between the PhD and the actual tenure track, and also the tenure track and post-tenure track. The air becomes crisper the further up you go. You get less and less stressed to a certain extent, right? In the post-tenure, it's a wonderful place. Your permanence, job security, and by then, you're like the 7th Dan black belt or a Shaolin monk, right? That you start to see things that you kind of know. Your skills are built to such a high level that you can smell when there's something wrong with the paper, right? There's actually, you learn to pattern recognition and things like that. You learn to kind of have almost a sixth sense, but it takes a long time to get that intuition. It takes a long time to get that gut instinct. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's a very long time path. So, if you're a soccer player, for instance, and you're gifted, and maybe you just started playing soccer at 15 and you were suddenly playing for Arsenal or Barcelona when you were 18, right? But usually you hear in sports, if they're tennis or soccer, that the kid picked up, tennis racket at 5, or they were playing soccer when they were 3 or 4 in their back garden, right? So usually, even if you've got a lot of skill, it's taken you a long time, but still, it's not quite as long until you're playing for a top club. So in terms of academe, it really is a long time. It usually is about 15 years. Now, granted, the first 4, typically you're an undergraduate student, and maybe you weren't even thinking about becoming an academic. So you've kind of done those 4, whether you like it or not. But if you were really coming out of high school asking this question, then yeah, you're going to go to college for 3 or 4 years most likely. So that's 4 years right there. And if you're going to be an academic, it usually means you've probably worked pretty hard during those 4 years. And your college grades are going to reflect that. And then you get in with those good college grades, you get into some kind of a postgraduate degree program. Initially, it could be a master's, or that could be converted in towards a PhD, which is several years. Usually it's about 5 years. It can be longer, or it can be shorter in certain circumstances. 5 years is a pretty good rule of thumb. So that's 4 plus 5 right there. And then tenure track, usually it's about 6 years. Again, it can change. So that's already 15 years until you have the much coveted permanence. That's a long time. Now, you can lengthen this in the sense that maybe you've had a few years of a gap years in between, getting some experience, doing various master programs. Maybe you didn't get accepted the first time you applied to reapply to colleges. Maybe now you had to do a pre-doctoral program, as is increasingly common. Maybe your PhD got extended. It could have been that, you've done a certain field that takes 7 years or 8 years or even 9 years. Life can interrupt. Then when you go into your academic tenure, maybe you did not get the position straight away, so you worked as a postdoc. You could be there for the best part of half a decade or longer. And then even at the actual tenure track, maybe you didn't go through maybe where you get tenure wasn't the actual original place you started, because maybe you changed laterally or even vertically. Maybe you changed for various reasons. It could be that you were scared that you weren't going to get tenure. It could be that you were going to switch for a better job offer in terms of money, or in terms of even the institution could be a higher quality institution going up the ranking. It could be that you had a spouse or a significant life change that you had to follow. All kinds of reasons. You could be delaying because you had children, like an extra year on the clock, or maybe even the COVID year. So typically, not always, a lot of people are around about 40 by the time they get academic tenure. Now, it does happen that they're still in their 20s, but that's almost unheard of, right, these days. For me, in my case, I was about 34 going up for it, and that was considered pretty young. And, I have a friend who was about 33, which was extremely young going up for it. Now, where I am, pretty much everyone around me was around about 40 years old. Maybe late 30s, but in a lot of cases they were well into their 40s. So, if you're a soccer player and, you're a football player, now maybe you're absolute brilliant. You can start playing soccer at 15 and then you discover you got a natural talent, and by the time you're 18, you're playing for Barcelona, or you're playing for Arsenal or something like that. And okay, that's 1 in a million. Most people in tennis that I've talked to, or in sports, professional sports players, they come in, they're maybe working here at the university, they've got a scholarship. They've told me that they've been starting playing when they were like 3 or 4 or 5 years old. So it's taken them quite a while, right? But academia is a huge long time. And of course, to be an industry expert, if you compare where you are as a professor, a senior professor, it can take decades in other countries like Europe or Ireland. But also, by that skill set, you're talking about a partner at a firm. So it does take a long time either way. Now, if you went into industry, it would take long too, but not usually that long, right? Because you're working almost day one out of the gate. But you are talking about a top level. And if you want to become, if you want to earn a lot of money, I would probably recommend more like working towards industry and corporate, maybe going into the corporate suite, C-suite jobs like CEO, CFO, COO, etc. Or going into stem cells, or maybe becoming an entrepreneur. That's really, if you're chasing money, it's probably not, academia is not for you, unless it's the hourly rate. There's other perks that are wonderful. Now, you can move laterally, so at the same level, different colleges, different universities, or sometimes you can go vertical, right? It might be the case that you actually come into the next place with a promotion. That's not always the case though. Usually when you're within the institution you're at, you can go vertical in terms of getting promotion. Although in terms of financial promotion, that usually happens with outside offers. Either you stay at a place and you get an outside offer and you use that outside offer to negotiate your salary up, or you take the outside offer. It's usually quite stagnant in the US. Unlike, let's say, Ireland, where the income goes up over time. In the US, you don't usually see a tremendous income growth. It's usually just when you go from one institution and you're poached by another institution. For all these moves, externally or internally, it's really about your research. Pay typically increases when you go external, not really internal. It's internal, it's more, if you get an outside offer, which is almost external, right? You just didn't make the switch, you just stayed here, but you had the offer. Or you've actually taken on a service role. Maybe you've become the chair of a department, or you've gone into the dean's office, or you've gone into administration. Eventually at the top of that would be like a provost of a university, or provost, as we say back in Ireland. Okay, so beyond how to become one, how is life as one? So really a lot of it's to do with mentoring and service. Now initially it's going to be upwards, so it's going to be usually you're receiving the mentorship. Maybe when you're looking at more senior people giving you advice. Then it could also be the other way where you're the one giving advice. You're not receiving it now, you're giving the advice to people who are more junior than you. This could be undergraduates, or it could be graduate students if you happen to be in a place where there are graduate students. And at some point there's also sideways mentorship, where maybe you're all assistant professors and you're reviewing each other's papers. Now, also beyond mentoring, again, mentoring is a huge part of it. A lot of the actual students, you end up realizing very quickly that mentorship is a big part of the job, is service. Now, usually juniors are given a lighter load in terms of service, but as you become more senior, service loads typically pick up. And there's lots of different types of service. It could be within your department or college or university, or external to it. It could be networking. For instance, you could be setting up a conference and organizing a conference. You could be reviewing journals. You could be reviewing articles. You could be even editing a journal. You could even be individually speaking at a conference. One thing that's often overlooked is the amount of traveling that we can sometimes do as academics. We're usually spending time visiting other institutions, traveling for conferences. Now, some of this has become more virtual in the advent of COVID and after COVID. But a lot of it still is physical travel and looking for funds and grants and moving here, moving there temporarily, flying, staying in hotels. You get to see a lot of the world that way. Now, monetarily, yeah, if you think about the amount of work you do, you're probably, if you're an academic, that probably meant that you worked hard during your undergrad years, those 4 years potentially as an undergrad. And you probably worked as a result then to get into your PhD. And then during your PhD, master's at the beginning, you probably worked hard as well to get through it and to do well enough. And if you're in that maybe top 1% of people that will actually get through and get an academic job, and then if you get to tenure, you're probably talking about another 50% drop off. So now you're in the top 0.5%. And that's going to be a lot of hard work to get all the way up there. So if you compare that to someone who went into industry, it's most likely that with your skill set and your hard work, you could probably be making more had you got into industry, but they don't have the same job security, typically speaking, that you will if you get tenure. And that essentially is a big trade-off, right? You're trading off job security for potentially higher monetary yearly income, and not the hourly rate necessarily, but the yearly rate. It's still a great salary. Again, the higher up you go in terms of the research university, but you may be sharing, especially if you're working in the US, you may be sharing the cost of raising a family with your other spouse, because you're not going to be an absolute baller here in that regard. Money is not what you're chasing. Impact, intellectual curiosity, the love of teaching, research, these things are more important to you than money. That's usually the case of an academic, so I'm not going to sell it on it's a fantastic financial life. If money is your thing, think about the corporate suite jobs, think about entrepreneurship, think about some of the STEM sailed fields. They're probably going to make more money in that direction than becoming an academic. That said, it's a great insurance. It's a great, for those that are more risk averse, look, you can be on a 6-figure income depending on what particular field you go in, and depending on how successful you are as well and what institution you end up working as. And it's fairly stable income over time if you get academic tenure. But it's great for starting a family because you have a lot of flexibility, right? You have a lot of time off. Now that means that, look, if you're only working as a teacher a few hours a day, it might mean that you can arrange so that you're able to be taking your kids to school in the morning, collecting your kids from school in the late afternoon. You can go into the university in between. A lot more time freedom than some other jobs it typically allows. This can be great if you're starting a family. You're not also typically going in and out of the college every single day of the week, and certainly not every single month of the year all the time. Now there are some academics that do that, and more power to them, but at the end of the day it's really just your teaching, your research, and your service. You fulfill this, you work hard, you do your work, but you can work almost anywhere. You can work from home, you can work, of course, if you're going away for field experiments, it really is up to you a lot of the time. There are these perks like that. So it is great for starting a family and being able to work from home. Some people, they love working in the library. That was me as an undergraduate. And then somehow in my graduate career, I flipped from preferring to work from the library to suddenly preferring to work from home. Look, when I was an undergraduate, I just could not work at home to save my life. I had to go into the library. Now it's the opposite. Now I find it much easier to work at home. I get tired when I go into work. I get tired when I go into the library. Whereas at home, I can go and I can get my food. And that might change when I have children and they're running around and stuff like that, right? But and they might be, you know, as much as you love them, you know, they might be distracting you a little bit. So there is that. All right, here's where I download my brain into yours. If you're serious about building real wealth, I put everything together in one full course, from $0 to Multimillionaire. It's basically me handing you 20 years of hard-won financial knowledge, covering personal finance, investing, real estate, alternative assets, taxes, and financial freedom strategies. Links below, and you can use code Michael for a discount. Start wherever you're at. Just make sure that you're moving forward. That was the course plug. Now let's make you unstoppable with money. So look, in terms of opportunities, I mean, you know, a lot of people, they come in and they might teach a 1-1 or 2-2. And what that means is if you have 2 semesters in a calendar or an academic year, it could be that you're teaching 1 course per term, which is like 1-1, or 2-2 would be 2 courses per term. Now, usually you can also do things like staggering, like 1-0 or 2-1 or 3-2. As you're looking at something like a 1-1, you're probably talking like a research institution, more like an Ivy League top college. Or if you go into the 2-2s, the 3-3s, you're more likely looking at a private liberal arts college or really good private college. When you get higher than the 3-3s, like you're looking at 4-4 and above, you know, you may be in a community college, or maybe you're not looking at a research role. You're probably more pure teaching, and it gets very burdensome at that point. Now, there can be more courses that you're teaching in the trimester system or abroad, but one way we make money is teaching out of load. So that means if you have a 2-2 and you ask to take on 2-3 or 3-2, so you're taking on more than what your annual contract dictates, it could be that you've asked for it, or it could be that the department needs it, you're helping out, but usually then your salary will go up that particular year just to reflect what you've taken on. So beyond teaching out of load, another way that academics make money is consulting. So I know several people, let's say in the law school or in College of Business, other colleges, that do consulting on the side. And they often do this to industry and earn quite a bit doing it. I also know several people, let's say in economics, back in my home country of Ireland, that were board members in different institutions. Usually these are charities or philanthropies, but they can be other institutions too. And a great place to find opportunities is somewhere like LinkedIn, where there's lots of different communities. Now, there's also transferable skills that you've developed over time. If you're in computer science, for instance, you probably could be a freelance coder. If you're in accounting, you could probably be a CPA. Pretty much every academic can do speaking, and speaking can usually be quite a lucrative, small, outside source of income. And a big one is mentorships. All kinds of places are looking to get experts, usually academics, to do some mentoring. I know quite a few people from, say, the College of Engineering, the College of Business, who are involved with startups, usually advising. This is usually in tech or in finance, but can be in different industries. So looking back over everything, look, I've had a wonderful time. I mean, the time freedom, the task variety, I just love doing so much. Every day is new. The lessons that I've learned, just wonderful. The skills that I've built, like in macroeconomics, all the knowledge, history, in computing, the coding, in AI, finance, you name it, even speaking, everything. I've learned so much. You know, I've kind of got to the level, I feel, in certain regards where I can sniff a paper, I can sniff a project, right? It's almost like that 7th Dan black belt Shaolin monk, right? You get to the certain level where you start to see pattern recognition, you start to get intuition, you start to realize, oh, this is where something is, you know, something doesn't smell quite right here. And then you start to give and delegate tasks to people who are kind of learning the skills that are coming up. The outside endeavors, I mean, I've done media, I've done engagements where I was helping out, let's say for instance, with the ambassadors program between Pennsylvania, the US, and Ireland and Trinity, in terms of giving advice to students and parents of students at high school that want to go and study at Trinity College Dublin and other Irish universities. I've done a lot of outside endeavors which have been very fun over the years. The relations, the people I've met, the friendships, the acquaintances, the shorter ones and some of the longer lasting ones, the Nobel Prize winners I've met, the bright minds, the fascinating conversations, the lessons I've learned. Look, it's not the same when you do it virtually and you're just talking to people online. Whereas when you go to conferences, you meet them in person and you have coffee, you have lunch, you can make friends. When you invite people over, like I have in the past, to come to visit my university, to give talks, and you show them around for the day, you give them a tour of the campus, you have them into your office, maybe you meet with them for lunch afterwards, you meet them at their hotel for breakfast, and then you're talking during the seminar. It's just a wonderful overall life. And of course, the actual biggest reward, the esteem, the kudos, that cannot be overrated. So if this is something that you might be especially gifted for, and you might have the characteristics and maybe the interest, then I highly recommend the life of an academic. And if you have any questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to jot those down in the comment section below.